Hey, it's Larry. Thanks for listening. Happy New Year. Real quick, before we get into this episode, I had such an amazing, eye-opening, life-changing experience at the World Parkinson Congress in Kyoto that I want others to have that opportunity too. So Becca Miller and I and 24 of our PD community friends have launched a year-long WPC travel grant fundraiser. We're each doing a 2-week Facebook fundraiser. Mine's underway right now because my birthday's January 9th. All the money raised will be used to help offset travel costs so more people with young onset Parkinson's can attend the next WPC in Barcelona in 2022. You can search out details on the When Life Gives You Parkinson's Facebook page or donate directly to the WPC website. Go to WPC2022.org/YOPD fund. If you or your business would like to supply matching funds, hey, good on ya. Email me at parkinsonspod@curiouscast.ca. And now, on with the show. Hi, I'm Larry Gifford. I have Parkinson's disease, and I'm going to the World Parkinson Congress. This is WPC 2019, the official podcast for the 5th World Parkinson Congress. The event is being held June 4th through 7th, 2019 in Kyoto, Japan. This podcast is created in collaboration with the World Parkinson Coalition and my other podcast, When Life Gives You Parkinson's. This is the travel episode. Kyoto life hacks, tips, vocab, etiquette advice, and more all in one place. From introductions, gifts, unlucky numbers, to bathrooms, restaurants, and money. Download this podcast and listen to it again on the plane. To get us up to speed, I want to welcome back to the podcast James Heron. He is the Executive Director of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. James has been preparing us each episode for what we can expect when we arrive in Japan. Let's start today with a series of words, some vocabulary. How about, how do we say hello, James?
Hello.
Nicely played. But hello in Japanese is a bit more challenging than that.
What makes it slightly more complicated is that depending on the time of the day, Japanese has 3 different greetings. So in the morning, you would say good morning, which is Ohayo gozaimasu.
Ohayo gozaimasu. Can you just say Ohio?
You can. It's less formal, but I think it'll be appreciated.
Okay, very good. And then what's midday?
Midday, really up until it sort of becomes evening, you can say konnichiwa. If you write it out, it has 2 ends in it. So you want to hear both ends. Konnichiwa. So you hold the end sound a little longer.
Konnichiwa.
Yep, perfect.
Very good. And then evening?
The evening is konbanwa.
Konbanwa.
Yeah.
Okay. And what if you mix it up? What if you say Ohio in the evening?
I think people will probably find it amusing, but certainly not offensive.
Okay. All right.
And in a worst case scenario, probably you can always fall back on a konnichiwa, and you won't be too far wrong in one direction or the other.
So after I figure out the greeting, how do I introduce myself?
What you need to say when you meet someone for the first time is hajimemashite.
Hajimemashite.
Mm-hmm. Hajimemashite, and then watashi wa Larry desu.
Watashi wa Larry desu?
Desu. So watashi means I.
Okay.
And wa means it's a particle that sort of marks the subject of a sentence. Then the name, so I am Larry, and the des is kind of the equivalent to the verb to be.
Oh, okay.
So hajimemashite, watashi wa Larry desu.
Okay. Hatichi, say the first part again.
Hajimemashite.
Hajimemashite.
Watashi
wa
Larry
desu.
Yeah.
All right. I'll have to work on that. We've said hello. We've introduced ourselves. And then what?
Well, I think it might be a little bit of a tongue twister, but it's probably one of the most useful expressions that you can use in Japan. And that's the expression, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Yoroshiku.
Yoroshiku?
Onegai shimasu.
Onegai shimasu.
Right. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. And what that tends to mean is sort of like, please treat me in a favorable manner. But it can also mean just, how are you? It's something that is that's often used, particularly in a first meeting or when you're asking someone for a favor.
What do I say if I accidentally bump into someone or I'm pushing my way through a crowd?
Sumimasen.
Okay, say that again now.
Sumimasen.
Sumimasen.
Yes. Sumimasen means excuse me.
I have a feeling I'll be using that a lot. Sumimasen, sumimasen.
Yeah, so it can be excuse me as if you're sort of pushing through a crowd. It can be excuse me if you don't hear something properly, but it can also is often sometimes used as a thank you as well. If someone serves you food or gives you something, gives you tea or something, often people will say, rather than saying arigato, they will say sumimasen. Sort of again, excuse me for putting you out or something like that. So it's a really good kind of all-purpose phrase.
Now, is there a gesture that goes with that?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Just sumimasen.
All right. So in the same vein as excuse me, how do you say, I'm sorry?
Okay. And hopefully it's not one that any of us will need to use too often, but it is gomen nasai.
Gomen nasai.
Gomen nasai. Yeah.
When would you use that?
Well, I'll be honest with you. The Japanese apologize a lot. I know they say that about Canadians as well, but the
Sure.
Japanese do it as well. And I think one of the reasons that they do it is, apologies in Japan are not seen as sort of an admission of guilt or fault. I mean, it's not really a very litigious society. So apologies in Japan are just sort of seen as kind of a Band-Aid for, if there's been any kind of a breach of harmony or something. An apology is a way to simply clear the slate and get back to communicating and putting things right.
Say it one more time.
Gomen nasai.
Gomen nasai. All right.
One of the stereotypes of a North American is someone who rather than apologizing is always making excuses for why something went wrong. And sometimes an excuse means that you're not really taking responsibility for it, but to apologize means that you're taking it seriously and you're going to deal with it.
Oh, that's great. Now let's deal with food. This is one of my favorite topics. What do I need to know about food?
Well, when you're sitting down to eat, or just before you eat, Japanese people would say itadakimasu. Itadakimasu. Yeah.
Itadakimasu.
Exactly. And it doesn't really translate into anything other than sort of I am about to receive or partake. Maybe the equivalent of saying, bon appetit or something like that.
And what is the traditional toast or phrase that you might say before you take a drink?
Kanpai.
Kanpai.
Kanpai, yeah. And that really means dry cup. So bottoms up, I guess. So, and we talked about saying itadakimasu before you eat, but at the end of the meal, there is another sort of set expression, and that one is gochiso-sama deshita.
Okay, let's slow that down for me.
Gochiso-sama.
Gochiso-sama.
Deshita.
Deshita.
Yeah. And it really just sort of gochiso is a word that means a treat or a feast. And so it just really means to translate it directly, it was a wonderful treat, a wonderful feast, something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So
you can say that to either to hosts, or if you're paying at a restaurant, you would often say that to the person as you're paying the bill in the restaurant.
Now that we've eaten and had some sake, we'll need to know how to find the washroom.
The phrase for where is the washroom is toire wa doko desu ka?
Toire wa toko desu ka?
Doko desu ka?
Doko desu ka.
Exactly, yeah. It ties a little bit to the Japanese, watashi wa Larry desu. So first of all, the first word you're using is toire, which is toilet.
I thought that was going to be toilet. Oh, right.
Well, the Japanese take a lot of words, a lot of English words, and they add Japanese sort of pronunciation to them, because foreign words are spelled out in a special phonetic system called katakana. So they take on a kind of a Japanese pronunciation. And then what happens is the Japanese will often then shorten the word. So, for example, if you look at Starbucks in Japan, they would call it Starbucks, but then they would shorten that to Staba. So,
Okay.
so Staba is Starbucks in Japan. The word for sexual harassment in Japan, they would take the exact word sexuaru harassmento, and then they would shorten that to sekuhara. So it's sort of a pattern that goes on in Japan. So toiretto became toire.
Great.
So you'll run into a lot of words like that in Japan. So toire for toilet, and wa, again, which marks the subject of a sentence. Then the word doko, which is where. And then we talked about the word des, which is the verb to be. And then ka. If you add ka at the end of a sentence, it makes it a question.
Okay.
Toire wa doko desu ka?
Is it kind of like a?
No, they do use an a in Japan, which is ne.
Okay.
If you hear the Japanese say ne a lot, that's kind of a version of a Canadian a. But if you add ka, it becomes a question.
Gotcha. All right. One final vocabulary word today. How do we say goodbye?
I guess to say goodbye to someone in a very informal way, you might just say "sore dewa."
And how do you spell that? Do you know?
SOREDEWA.
Sore dewa?
Yeah. Or you could just say, like if you're going to see someone the next day, you could just say mata, which is MATA, which means again, and then ashita, ASH, silent ITA, mata ashita.
All right, James, now let's dive into the nuances of the Japanese culture.
One of the things that people often find they have to deal with when dealing with Japanese people is a lot of ambiguity. And then the difficult sometimes to draw out opinions or to get a clear yes or no. And that's something that's really, I think it's driven by some of the cultural ideas that underpin Japanese culture. One of them being harmony, or the Japanese word for harmony is wa.
Wa?
Which is probably one of the most fundamental, Japanese cultural concepts. In fact, the word wa, which means harmony, is actually used in a lot of Japanese words to give a connotation of something's Japaneseness. So wa shoku is Japanese food. Wa fuku is Japanese clothing. Washitsu means a Japanese style room. So it's very central to the Japanese psyche, as is sort of groupism and the need to sort of not put your opinions out there until sort of group consensus has been reached. And another reason for this ambiguity is can be sort of the cultural homogeneity you find in Japan. Things don't always have to be said in order to be understood, because Japan is a culture where it's one culture, it's one race of people. Everyone that comes through the same education system, there's a great deal of homogeneity. So in other words, you don't necessarily have to say something for it to be understood because of that great shared context. And it's one of the reasons, for example, why haiku poetry can be so powerful, even though it's really only 17 syllables. But
Right.
There can be cultural markers in those very, very short poems that can open up huge swaths of meaning to the Japanese listener.
So is there a yes or no, or is it always just sort of this ambiguity?
Well, the Japanese will say yes a lot, and yes in Japanese is hai.
Hi?
Hai. But again, it shouldn't be mistaken for the actual yes, as in we are in agreement. Hai simply means it's an acknowledgement that I'm listening to you. So if a Western business person was coming out of a meeting having heard yes, 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 assuming that the Japanese were in agreement with everything he said, well, there could be a significant misunderstanding there. And the Japanese also tend not to say no it tends to be probably a little bit too direct. But, the Japanese will signal no, sometimes through body language, which I'll talk about next week, but also through expressions that suggest no. Often people will say, "Oh, that's very difficult," which is not a challenge to fix a problem. Often it means that it can't be done. And there's also some sometimes set expressions in Japanese that, again, communicate no. For example, we will examine this matter in a forward-looking manner. That is almost, that's a set Japanese expression, which is a little bit of a kiss of death. When you hear that, they're not interested.
So you kind of have to, pardon the expression, read the tea leaves. Yeah,
you do. Yeah, you definitely read between the lines. We as North Americans, we tend to sort of get to the point. We tend to speak in very direct lines of communication, where the Japanese will approach things often in a much more indirect manner. So in Japan, sometimes to beat around the bush or to go in circles is not seen necessarily as a negative. So it's really important when you are dealing with Japanese and you're trying to draw out an opinion. Sometimes you just have to let things proceed at the Japanese pace and let over time, let the wheat separate from the chaff, and be careful not to sometimes push for an opinion or push for an answer if you're not getting it. What that'll sometimes do is just shut down the communication process altogether. So sometimes just a little extra patience is necessary.
Let's talk about some of the nonverbal communications that we might encounter.
Sure. Well, let's again, because Japan is a high context culture, sometimes things don't have to be necessarily said to be communicated. And so some typical Japanese things, there's one I think of as the Japanese smile. And that is, it's not something that we don't understand as North Americans. We have a nervous laugh in the West, but often in Japan, if someone is uncomfortable with something, they will smile. And so I often tell people, if you see someone smiling kind of out of context, that might indicate that maybe an inappropriate request has been made, or something too sensitive has been brought into the conversation, or that the Japanese just really don't know how to react.
And then what do you do if you notice that?
Simply I would just say, sort of dial it back and change the direction. And
do you say sumimasen?
Well, you could do that. You could do that if it's quite clear that the person is uncomfortable. Another thing is eye contact. For us in the West, a lack of eye contact can sometimes imply a lack of sincerity or pride, or that maybe we're even, we're even hiding something. But to the Japanese, prolonged eye contact can sometimes suggest aggressiveness or hostility and can be unnerving. So I would say, make eye contact, but you can break eye contact in Japan without giving any kind of a negative message.
But no contact is shady.
No, yeah, you'll want to make some eye contact, but again, probably I wouldn't hold your eye contact as long as you might with a Western counterpart. And often, what will happen is Japanese people will shift their eye contact more down towards the chin as opposed to the eyes. So can kind of go back and forth. But too much eye contact, again, can be a little bit of an aggressive gesture. Also, posture is important. And when I say posture, again, it's more a case of, not to do things like leaning on desks or tables or leaning against the wall or the door frame. Sometimes that can appear just a little too casual.
Okay.
Dress and grooming is also important in Japan. Certainly in business context, Japanese people tend to wear, more sober, serious, and sort of conservative clothing. I remember going to Japan a number of years ago to do a little bit of business protocol training for some Americans who were running a Japanese office there, and they were in the process of trying to have a casual Friday, and I know the Japanese workers were not exactly sure how to deal with that, and in fact, at the entrance to their office, written entirely in Japanese, no English, there was actually a little apology saying we are dressing casually today because it's Casual Friday, and then essentially we apologize for any inconvenience or discomfort that this may cause for our visitors or something. So there's also issues of personal space.
Okay.
Even though sometimes the Japanese will find themselves in very, very close personal spaces, like on a train, for example. In general, North Americans, we're comfortable with about 18 to 24 inches of personal space, but for the Japanese, it tends to be typically a little farther apart, maybe 36 inches.
Oh,
so. I would give a little more space to Japanese colleagues.
You need a wider berth as you maneuver through the country.
Yeah. Also, voice, because I guess high regard is placed on restraint and graciousness, it's important to avoid raising your voice, especially in anger. The Japanese will find this quite threatening and rude. And again, it sometimes will fit you into that common alienating stereotype of the Westerner being sometimes a little bit on the loud or abrasive side. And maybe the final thing I'll offer will be gestures in general. The Japanese tend not to gesture quite as much, but if you look at gestures in general, often, for example, if you go to some, say, Southern European countries, there will be more physicality in people's communication. So people will tend to gesture from the shoulder. So that will be sort of the pivot, will be the shoulder. While if you were, say, to go to maybe North America or more Northern European countries, the gestures tend to be a little smaller. Perhaps the gestures tend to come from the elbows out.
Right.
And in Japan, I would say that would be more at the wrist.
Wow. Okay. So
very
subtle.
Be a little bit smaller. So yeah, big gesticulations again. Japanese might find that a little overwhelming. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
From our conversations, I understand that the Japanese are very concerned about hospitality.
The Japanese version of hospitality, the word is omotenashi. Omotenashi, which essentially means dealing with every aspect of the needs of your visitor without having to be asked. So often I think sometimes, you might find when you go to Japan that the hospitality is almost overwhelming, and that you don't have a lot of breathing room because everything is perfectly and carefully planned out for you. And we sometimes call it a hospitality juggernaut. But it's it might be overbearing or overwhelming, but it is what the Japanese view of perfect hospitality includes, this taking care of every possible need.
And what could be involved in that?
Well, it can be everything from planning every second of your visit, and where you're going to meet, and when you're going to meet, and when you're going to sit down to eat, and when you're going to finish eating. So a very careful and detailed scheduling for every minute of the day.
Very structured.
Yes, and there's a lot of structure as well in Japan around the idea of gift giving. And it's a big part of Japanese life. There's a number of important gift giving sort of seasons in Japan. Some that won't affect us, but there's sort of a midsummer gift exchange called Ochugen, and there's a year-end gift giving season called Osebo. But there's also a lot of sort of gift rituals throughout the year. In Japan, they have Valentine's Day. But on Japanese Valentine's Day, it is women giving chocolate to men. And often they give something called giri choco, which is obligation chocolates, which is what you give to your boss or to your coworkers, but not necessarily obviously indicating any kind of a romantic feeling. Right. And then 1 month later, on March the 14th, is White Day, and White Day is the day that men traditionally give cookies to the ladies.
Oh, that's nice.
There's also omiyage, which is the Japanese for souvenir, and the Japanese have a great deal of obligation or pressure to give souvenirs to their coworkers and family and friends when they get home. So even if they're on a 3-day whirlwind tour of a city, they'll probably take at least a half a day to make sure that they have all of their gifts bought to take back to Japan.
Wow.
Yeah, but for us, when we go to Japan, it's always good to take gifts, and gifts are given in a very similar way to the business card exchange. So they're offered with 2 hands, and they're received with 2 hands as a sign of respect. Often the Japanese will give the gift and receive the gift, but they will not open it in front of you. Okay. And there's no expectation that you should have to open yours, because really it's the ritual that's most important. But if you want, they may ask you, "Oh, please open your gift," and if you would like them to open their gift, you're certainly free to do it. It's not an issue at all. Okay. It's usually given at the end of a dinner or at the end of a meeting. And it's important to not avoid certain colors in your wrapping. Black and white can be funeral colors, and so those should be avoided. Also, avoid gifts that come in 4s or the number 9. Those are unlucky numbers in Japan.
4 and 9.
Yeah, 4 sounds like shi, which is death. And the word for 9 is ku or q, which sounds very much like the word for suffering.
All right, so avoid 4 and 9.
Yeah. Also, for gifts, you probably want to avoid gifts, things like scissors or knives or letter openers, because they signify separation. Okay. But good gifts are things like things that are quintessentially Canadian. And gifts also, particularly in the early stages, should be something that is consumable. Oh, okay. Things like ice wine or maple syrup or maple cookies or smoked salmon, things like that are very good. And then perhaps as the relationship deepens, if it's a relationship between 2 companies and they sign a contract, then something that's more permanent becomes a more appropriate gift, like maybe a native art piece or something like that. But you certainly don't want to give something like that at the beginning of a relationship if, for example, you don't know whether the relationship has any long-term aspect to it. At which point that permanent object becomes a little bit awkward. Sure. All right. That's good advice. Yeah. And also, again, if you're going to be meeting a lot of people, take Canada pins and company, Canada pens and things like that. They're always a good gift as well. Let's talk toilets. In Japan, you'll run into 3 different types of toilets, potentially. There is the traditional Japanese toilet, which is a kind of a squat type toilet. These are more and more rare all the time. It's sort of a long porcelain trough that you would squat over and do your business. Okay. So it's pretty simple, but it can be a little bit of a challenge if for flexibility. I'm not as young as I used to be, and some of these Japanese style toilets can be a bit of work. Right. But you probably now will only run into those if you are, if you're in the countryside, maybe in a little inn or something like that. Far more likely, you'll run into two styles of Western toilet. They're the kind of more traditional Western toilets, which look like what we have here. One interesting difference is that on the back of and top of the tank, when you flush it, there is a little fountain that pours water out, and it goes back into the tank. So the water that it's being used to flush comes out of this fountain first so that you can use it to wash your hands before it goes down into the cistern. So it's just a little water-saving device. The other type of toilet is, I don't know if you've run into these before, these sort of space-age Japanese toilets that are becoming more and more ubiquitous in Japan, the ones that actually have the water jets that do a lot of the cleaning process for you.
Yeah, I've read about these. I've seen video of them. I've not experienced it, but it's very intimidating.
They are actually, they're not intimidating, and they're actually quite pleasant and quite hygienic. Essentially, all you do is there's a little control panel beside the toilet, and there's a lot of Japanese written on there, but there's also some diagrams which make it pretty clear what's going to happen. So there's a button for bidet, and there's a button for washing your other nether regions, let's call them. Mm-hmm. And then there's one for dryer. So it'll actually dry you as well.
Okay. Excellent. I look forward to it.
And some of the newer ones will also have lights on them. Usually they will have a seat warmer, because a lot of Japanese homes and places don't have central air conditioning. So the washroom itself may not be warm, but the seat will be very invitingly warm.
Oh, that's great.
It's not that issue. And you'll also notice that Japanese toilets are usually located separate from your where your washing area will be, the bath and the sink and everything like that.
Okay.
Because in Japan, it tends to be sort of counterintuitive to have the place that is supposed to be for cleaning to be in the same room where you are essentially getting rid of waste material.
Right.
So they tend to be separate unless you're in a hotel. Sometimes in a small hotel room, you might have kind of a sort of like an airplanes type of bathroom where everything's sort of in the same space. But so when you go to a Japanese bathroom itself, you'll notice that there'll be a tub and a shower, but usually the tub is separate from the shower. So the tub is not there to wash. The tub is there for soaking. It tends to be very deep, very hot. And beside that, there'll be a low shower with a little stool, and what you're supposed to do is you go in and you wash yourself first. So the shower is for cleaning yourself, and then once you're clean, you get into the tub, and that's where you soak.
I guess that's an important thing to know.
It is important because often, for example, if you're going into a Japanese person's home, traditionally a family will use the same bath water for the entire family, with the understanding that everyone is clean before they get into the tub. So if you just sort of jump into a Japanese bathtub and you're dirty or you're covered in soap, you make that water unusable for the people that would be coming next.
And it's wasteful.
It is wasteful. You'll find if you wind up going to a public bath or a public hot spring, essentially it's the same rules. There'll be showers, and there'll be tubs for soaking. They'll be very separate, and you may have to make sure that you get that order correct.
Get that order correct. All right. Thanks,
yes.
James.
And bathing is a very central part of Japanese life. So definitely find the opportunity to enjoy a Japanese bath or a Japanese hot spring while you're there.
I got a great story about a hot spring my wife and I visited in rural Taiwan that I won't get into here, other than to say there was a major language hurdle both sides had to leap over. Do many Japanese speak English?
Well, in Japan, people study English a lot, to the point sometimes where I think some Japanese almost have a little bit of a mental block. I think the Japanese education system when it comes to English, I think it's a bit traumatic. Getting into universities, there's a lot of test takings and et cetera. So I think a lot of Japanese might have a little bit of a phobia, but they will have probably a decent background in English, particularly if it's written English. But speaking can often be a little more of a challenge. Having said that, when you do go to international conferences, et cetera, the Japanese do put an effort into putting their best English speakers forward.
And then when you're saying Ohayo or Konnichiwa or Kanbawa, are there hand gestures that go with that? Do you bow? Do you wave? What do you do?
It really. I would take the Japanese lead. Bowing is one of those things. It's very much based on circumstance. But when you just meet a colleague during the day, you wouldn't necessarily need to bow or shake hands. You would just say konnichiwa. I think actually, when it comes to communications, it's an opportunity for us to address some of the stereotypes that the Japanese sometimes have about North Americans, and we sometimes. Well, the Japanese tend to be very reserved, and as a result, we can sometimes come across as a bit overbearing or overly aggressive, simply just by doing what to us seems sort of commonsensical. And one of the ways we do that is in our communication styles. And to give you one example would be silence. In Japan, silence is an important part of the sort of the communication approach. And the Japanese have a saying that says, words separate and silence unifies. So there's some linguists have actually looked at North Americans versus Japanese and the amount of silence that we are comfortable with before we feel that something needs to be said. And in Japan, it's over 4 seconds. But for North Americans, after 3/4 of a second, we start to feel sort of a sense that that the communication is dying, and we need to sort of say something. So, that really comes down to we sometimes have to sort of dial things back a little bit, and sort of give a little more time to silence. Sometimes, again, it shows respectful listening, or that you consider what's been said. But also, if the Japanese person is working in their second language, it just might be necessary time for them to make the transition, to translate in their mind what's been said in English, and then to put together a response. So if we fill those silences too quickly, we sort of muddy the communication channels.
Interesting. So North Americans are 3/4 of a second.
Yeah.
Which is that, and the Japanese are 4 seconds, which is this.
Yes. So I'm certainly not telling anyone to pull out a stopwatch or anything like that, but simply to be a little more comfortable with silence.
Interesting. That's great advice.
Sort of, and I guess to keep in mind that idea of turn taking in conversation.
Earlier, we learned some great phrases to say before and after a meal. Now let's get into the etiquette around food.
When you do go to eat, particularly if you're going to a more traditional type of a restaurant or something like that, it's probably best to allow your hosts to seat you, because in Japanese restaurants, often seating is based on rank. So you don't it's best to let the Japanese tell you the best place to sit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then when you sit down, of course, you're faced with chopsticks, which is always worth, if you don't know how to use them, do your best to learn them before you go. But if you have any issues, the Japanese will be happy to provide you with a spoon or a fork, whatever is required.
And you just need to ask. You just need to ask for that.
Yes. Yeah. And the important thing with chopsticks is not to stick them upright in your rice, because that is something that is actually part of the funeral ritual.
Oh.
So to do that at at a dinner party is quite inappropriate. Also, you should never pass food with chopsticks. That also is part of the funeral ritual.
So, like, if I wanted to share some sushi with my wife, I wouldn't use my chopsticks to put it on her plate.
Well, you could do that, but you wouldn't want to have her take something with her chopsticks from yours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Often, too, if you're using a kind of a communal dish, people will sometimes turn around their chopsticks and use the end that hasn't gone into your mouth for picking up something from a communal dish. Again,
that's a good
just
idea.
seen as more hygienic.
Yeah.
In Japan, actually, particularly when you're eating noodles, it's okay to slurp and make noise.
Oh, good. Finally.
You don't have to, but certainly don't judge your Japanese hosts as having poor manners if they're slurping. It's just considered. It shows that they're enjoying the meal, and it's also thought that bringing a little air in with the noodles helps to bring out the taste.
Oh, okay. It's kind of like when they do wine tasting, they try to get air into it.
Yeah. The other thing that maybe worth pointing out is sushi is it can be eaten with chopsticks, but it's also often a hand food, so you can eat sushi with your hands.
Oh, okay.
And Japanese tend to, if you're the part that you're going to dip into the soy sauce, you should dip the actual fish portion as opposed to the rice portion in. So you sort of almost have to turn over the sushi and get the soy sauce onto the fish rather than the rice.
And I read somewhere you never want to just sort of dump soy sauce over the sushi.
Oh, no. Yeah, the Japanese don't pour soy sauce on anything, on the rice or on sushi. It's usually things are dipped into the soy sauce.
Okay. Do you take your shoes off when you go into restaurants?
It very much depends on the restaurant. More traditional places you will. Less traditional places for Western restaurants or a lot of different types of pubs, you don't have to, but it'll be very clear what you need to do when you enter the restaurant. When you do take your shoes off, there's usually a set of slippers that they'll give you, which will get you from there, from the entrance to the tatami mats in a traditional restaurant where you would just sit in your sock feet. Also, most traditional restaurants will have a separate set of slippers for the washrooms. So one of the classic blunders that we as foreigners make often is to put those toilet slippers on and to wear them back into the restaurant. So always make sure there's a lot of slipper changing in a traditional Japanese restaurant, but I think if you watch the people around you, you'll know what to do.
Well, and that may be challenging for some of the folks that are headed to the conference who have a hard time, controlling their body and stuff. Do you have to wear slippers?
You don't. As I said, the Japanese are very courteous, and if people have any sort of disadvantages in terms of being able to negotiate some spaces, the Japanese will be very forgiving and very supportive of what people need. So I wouldn't consider that a concern.
Great. Thank you.
The last thing maybe I'll say with regards to food and drink is with regards to drinking, generally, whether it's beer or sake, you don't pour for yourself.
Oh, okay.
People will pour for you, and you sort of pour for other people. And when people go to pour for you, you sort of just lift your glass a little bit and let them pour.
Okay.
Which has the disadvantage sometimes you lose a little bit of control in terms of how much you're going to drink. So if you sip your drink to the bottom, you can usually expect it to be refilled.
And what if you don't want to refill?
If you don't want to refill, usually you would just put your hand over the glass and say thank you or no thank you, and just ask for something that's non-alcoholic.
James Heron, the Executive Director of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, thank you so much for your insight and time. From Curious Cast and the World Parkinson Coalition, this is WPC 2019. Visit WPC2019.org to learn about the upcoming 5th World Parkinson Congress, a global Parkinson's event that opens its doors to all members of the Parkinson's community, including those living with the disease like me. Follow WPC on Twitter at World PD Congress. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe for free. Search for WPC 2019 and When Life Gives You Parkinson's. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and everywhere you get your streaming audio. You can also listen at CuriousCast.ca and WPC2019.org. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just look up @Parkinson'sPod or email us at parkinsonspod@CuriousCast.ca. WPC 2019 is written and produced by me, Larry Gifford. Dila Velazquez is our story producer, and sound design by Rob Johnston. I look forward to seeing you in Kyoto.
Canada may be known for its landscapes and friendly people, but beneath the surface lies a darker side of crime, history, and the paranormal. Since 2017, the award-winning Dark Poutine podcast has explored the shadowy corners of the Great White North and beyond, delivering chilling tales from a uniquely Canadian perspective. Hosted by Mike Brown and Matthew Stockton with over 300 episodes and fresh releases every Monday, Dark Poutine is your weekly ticket to the creepier side of Canada. Listen to Dark Poutine on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts.